Well, good evening. It's now 5:30, so I'm going to begin, and if any people join us later, they'll just come partway through. Welcome to the first of our ecclesiastical law bite size. The aim is that we'll be having these sessions once a month for just half an hour, and the first part of the session will be recorded, and that will then be able to be a small library that we can have on somewhere like YouTube, so that if you're wanting to point people to a way of getting a little bit of information about ecclesiastical law, that will be a resource. For the first two or three of these, it's going to be Russell and myself talking to each other, but in the future we'll be having other speakers as guests. So if any of you feel there's an area that you already know quite a lot about, then we'd love you to volunteer to be guests. But I think that's probably best done by email at some other time rather than by inviting yourselves today. It's really important, we'll say this every time we do one of these, this is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, we need you to contact a lawyer who is insured to give appropriate legal advice. What we're aiming to do here is to have an informal conversation. It's meant to be general and informative and resourcing, but we're covering ourselves that we might make mistakes. If we do, and it's a serious mistake, we'll of course pick up on it on a future recording or put something on a title with the recording just to cover it. If it's a minor mistake, well, that is life. We are human beings. So just to introduce myself, I'm the Venerable Moira Astin. Once I was asked whether I'd said vulnerable, and that did seem an appropriate title for an archdeacon. I'm the Archdeacon of Reigate, and I've been in this role for 7.5 years. I am not legally educated, but I have picked an awful lot up in the University of living and hanging around the Church of England, including having been on General Synod for 12 years and therefore having helped to write some of this law. I'm a trustee of the Ecclesiastical Law Society and I've been on the Clergy Discipline Commission for longer than it's sensible to be on it. Russell, you're going to be the main person who's talking today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Moira. Yes, I'm Russell Dewhurst. I'm the Communications Officer of the Ecclesiastical Law Society. I'm doing a PhD in canon law. I'm the chair of the Anglican Communion Legal Advisors Network. I teach ecclesiastical law in various capacities. So yeah, do quite a few different things.
And do you have any background education in law, or are you, like me, someone who's picked it up later?
Only in canon law. The Cardiff LLM, which has recently come to an end, was a degree I took some years ago, and I'm, as I say, working on the PhD. But otherwise, no secular legal training.
Thank you. So today we're going to be thinking about what is ecclesiastical law. So, Russell, what is ecclesiastical law?
Well, thanks, Moira. It's obviously, I think, the best question to start this series with. What is ecclesiastical law? That's what we're going to be talking about each month. Well, I'll start according to the canonical tradition with the scriptural text. St. Paul says, "Let all things be done decently and in order." And I suppose following that teaching of St. Paul, all Christian communities over the years have found that they need some kind of regulation or rule or law in order to organize the life together of the church, from things like ministry to worship to property to rights, governance, and so on. And all those, generally speaking, those rules are matters internal to that religious community. So just as when I joined our village tennis club, by belonging, I'm implicitly or explicitly saying I agree to be bound by the rules of the club. It's analogous for most religious groups. By belonging, explicitly or more often implicitly, you're saying you agree to be bound by the rules of that community. But this is the exception, because in these bite-sized talks, we're mainly talking, aren't we, Moira, about the Church of England, and the Church of England here is in a special category.
So, what makes the Church of England different then?
Well, the Church of England is different in this respect, I suppose, because it is the established church in England. And it's often said the Church of England's law is part of the law of the land. So it's not just something that people who belong agree among ourselves to be bound by, but it is considered the law of the country that we live in.
So, if I wanted to find all this law, where would I look for it?
Well, I would begin, I think, with two principal sources of legislation, of law: measures and canons. If we were looking historically, we'd probably want to begin with Acts of Parliament. And in the past, most of the legislation to do with the Church of England was enacted by Act of Parliament. But over time, by the beginning of the 20th century, Parliament was finding it didn't have the time, and people were less sure it was appropriate for Parliament to be concerning itself with, if you like, the minutiae of one religious body. So Parliament passed something called the Church of England Assembly Powers Act 1919. And what that said was, if this church body called the Church Assembly was to pass some proposed legislation called a measure, then both Houses of Parliament would look at it, and if they resolved that it was acceptable, and if the King gave this legislation royal assent, then these measures would have the force and effect of an Act of Parliament.
So you're telling me you can have a measure to do anything, and it would be part of English law?
Absolutely right. That's right. A measure can, as you say, do pretty much anything. It can amend an Act of Parliament, repeal an Act of Parliament, or another measure. It's recognised by all the courts, ecclesiastical and temporal. I mentioned the Church Assembly. Nowadays, there's a successor body called the General Synod that a lot of people will, of course, have heard of. And that's the body that prepares these measures, and then they're submitted to Parliament for consideration. And once they become law, if they do, when they become law, you find them on the same website, legislation.gov.uk, as with Acts of Parliament.
So, but you've mentioned canons as well. So what are they?
Well, canons are another kind of legislation that we have in the Church of England. And again, it's down to General Synod to draft these canons, but they differ from measures in a couple of ways. Firstly, they're really only concerned with a relatively narrow category of topics, things like ministry and liturgy, and Parliament isn't consulted at all about the canons, generally speaking, but they do require royal assent and license before they become law.
Is that something to do with the King being the supreme governor on earth of the Church of England? Why you still need that?
Absolutely. This comes from the 1533 Act from Henry VIII. So yes, it's still the same. Until that point, there wasn't, at least not quite so formally, the role of the king. So it's I suppose a legacy of the Henrician Reformation.
Although, of course, he would argue in that act that he was merely making apparent what was already there. But that's church history, which is another of my specialities, but not for this point.
I think we must always watch out, Moira, you and I, not to veer off too much into church history, which we both love so much.
Indeed. So you've talked about measures and canons, but are there any other places where we get law that covers the Church of England?
Yeah, absolutely. I did mention Acts of Parliament, didn't I? And although historically they were much more important, they still are very relevant. Acts of Parliament certainly can affect law relating to ecclesiastical matters, although there is a convention that Parliament won't legislate specifically for the Church of England without the consent of the Church of England. But then more broadly, we can look at things like various kinds of regulations, church representation rules, guidelines, and there may be statutory guidance where you've got people sometimes have a duty to pay due regard to the guidance, all these things that we can bundle together, and sometimes people call it soft law. And then there are other sources, maybe a bit more nebulous, like custom, maybe even scripture, but a really important and very concrete other source of law is cases, that is to say, judgments from the ecclesiastical courts and other courts touching ecclesiastical matters, judgments that have been made in particular cases.
I guess there's also other law that counts in the Church of England just because we're in England, isn't there?
Absolutely. So all sorts of things that impinge on the life of the church, from data protection to employment law, all those sorts of areas. We wouldn't generally call them ecclesiastical law if they touch the church the way that they do any like organization. Still important. Probably not ecclesiastical law, but probably something that we will touch on as we come to it in these discussions, I would guess.
So we'll know that there are some times when your registrar won't be the person to go to because you're actually dealing with property law or employment law. Although I guess in the Church of England we then get into the issues of the fact that clergy aren't employed.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to who to go to with a question, a registrar is always the good first port of call, because they will be able to tell you if it's beyond their particular area of interest or the retainer or whatever, and that you should go to someone else. But I think a good person to start with. The difficulty maybe on some occasions in going straight to a secular lawyer, sometimes they might not be aware if there's a particular obscure piece of ecclesiastical law touching the matter in question. So to have some ecclesiastical involvement is often going to be a good idea, I would think.
And as an archdeacon, certainly when we come to leases and licenses, I think people have to talk with registrars first. Anyhow, you mentioned ecclesiastical courts. I mean, I know about, courts in the Old Bailey and things like this, but what are these ecclesiastical courts? And where do they have their buildings?
Well, good question. There are no or very few specific consistory court buildings. There are some places that have been used historically, and you can see from place to place. But not really to think of a building. The court ever meets, it often meets in the church that it's that it's particularly concerned with on that occasion. But the main ecclesiastical court we think of is the diocesan court, called the consistory court, and the diocesan chancellor is the judge of the court. And its main responsibility is to grant faculties. If someone wants to make a change to a church or a churchyard, they usually need to petition for a faculty, that is, for permission to do something. And that's something that the consistory court considers judicially. It's got some other functions, such as considering requests for exhumation from consecrated ground, and a few other functions. And then there are some other courts, and there are disciplinary tribunals and things like that. And all of these courts will produce decisions from time to time. And that's another source, another way in which the law develops as it tackles particular problems and difficulties and instances. And we can see how the law becomes clearer by its application to these instances.
Thank you, Russell. You've told us then where to find the law, but what sort of things does this law cover? What's this law all about?
Well, I could divide ecclesiastical law into 6 or 7 broad categories, I think. You could start with ecclesiastical government. How is the church governed? And in the Church of England, that happens at a number of different levels. We start at the parish level, perhaps, or other communities at a local level. We've got diocesan level government, and then the government of the Church of England as a whole. And we've talked a bit about legislation, but there are all sorts of other ways in which the church needs to be governed. And then we've got law about ministry. And in that category, I would include things like the rights of ordinary church members, all the different aspects of lay and ordained ministry, professional conduct, discipline, conditions of service, ordination, and so on. Then doctrine and liturgy. There's an area of law specifically concerned with questions about what can properly be preached, how is worship conducted. And then the next one I'd mention, very important one, well, they're all very important, rites and sacraments. What's the law about baptism and Eucharist, marriage and burial? And this is one of these areas of law where there's a lot of interaction between the secular law and the church's law, marriage law, making sure that burials are performed as they should be, and so on. And that's also true, this sort of church-state interaction when we come to my next little category, property and finance. When we think about changes to church buildings and churchyards, especially if they're listed, the state has an interest, but it's an area of ecclesiastical law as well, as I've mentioned. And then things like pay, pensions, housing for church officers. You mentioned leases and licenses, so all these sorts of things. And then finally, there's the relations of the church with other bodies, so our ecumenical relations with other Christian bodies, maybe with other religious groups and organizations as well. So I think there we've got 6 or 7 broad categories, and most of the questions we come across in ecclesiastical law, I think you fit into one or more of those categories. And often if you look at a textbook or a book on ecclesiastical law, you'll see broadly, if it's a general book, it'd be divided into categories a bit like that.
So that's really quite a lot of stuff, isn't it, to cover?
Absolutely. That's why we need to have these conversations every month, Moira, to cover everything in great detail. But I think to go back to the question for today, what is ecclesiastical law? I think another way of thinking about it is to think in terms of the law of England. Think about law of England. You've got criminal law, employment law, family law, and so on. Ecclesiastical law, you can say, is that part of the law that's concerned with the Church of England. And I think that's probably the simplest answer we can give to that question. What is ecclesiastical law?